Okay, chapter 13 and 14. And I'm really quite entertained, especially by chapter 14, just the way the writing is. In chapter 13, it's mostly just watching Rostov. Again, this young man, apparently he's on guard duty through the night, and he can just barely do everything to keep himself awake. He keeps falling asleep on his horse and being muddled around. I kind of found that an amusingly little bit, but I want to jump into chapter 14. We're just discussing this whole few moments before these two large armies do battle. And I like this one paragraph here. The smoke of the campfires, into which everything superfluous was being thrown, made the ice smart. It was cold and dark. The officers were hurriedly drinking tea and breakfasting. The soldiers were crowded around the fires, munching rusks and beating a tattoo with their feet. It's like just sort of drumming to warm themselves. They made firewood of the remains of the huts, the chairs, tables, wheels, tubs, everything they did not need or that could not be taken with them. I kind of like this, these little bits like this. They just kind of give us these very real and authentic glimpses into the everydayness. You know, here's this grand battle about to take place, and what are we brought to? You know, soldiers standing around. What's on their mind? I want to keep warm. I'm hungry. And even the officers too, just kind of just these very basic things consume their mind. They know they're on the verge of this something, but I like the way that it's just describing them just trying to stay warm and grab something to eat. And then they get the order. It's still like early dawn. They get the order to move. And the columns move forward, not knowing where they were going because of the surrounding masses of men, the smoke, and the increasing fog. So it's just an extremely foggy morning. Unable to see either the place to which they were going or the one they were leaving. So already we're getting this tone, this sense of tone. A soldier on the march is encompassed, confined, and borne along by his regiment, just like a sailor on a ship. And he goes on to describe comparing a sailor to a soldier in an army, and how a sailor, all he knows, you know, in the vast ocean, he hasn't a clue where he is, and he kind of doesn't care. All he knows is every day he wakes up, here's the mast, here's the sail, here's his fellow men, here's his job to do. And it's very much, he's saying, like a soldier in the army. You know, here's his, he says here, everywhere the same comrades, the same ranks, the same sergeant major, the same company dog, the same officers. The soldier, like a sailor, rarely cares to know the latitude in which his ship is sailing. And yet, on the day of battle, God knows how or whence it comes, in the moral atmosphere of the troops, the same stern note is heard by all, sounding the approach of something solemn and crucial, and awakening in them an unwanted curiosity. I love that. An unwanted curiosity. It almost seems like a contradiction, but it kind of it captures it, I think. The fog had become so dense that though it was growing light, they could not see 10 paces in front of them. Bushes looked like huge trees, and level ground like cliffs and hollows. The soldiers became aware that in front, behind, and on all sides, other Russian columns were moving in the same direction. Every soldier was heartened by knowing that wherever it was he was going, many, many more of our men were going too. And so there's this group, so there's a bit of a buoyancy to the group. It's foggy, but you take solace in being part of this army. The troops marched buoyantly, as they always do when going into action, especially when they are taking the offensive. And we've seen this repeatedly, how confident, positive, upbeat. We've seen this with Rostov for sure, Nikolai, how he's just hurrah into battle, and just literally seconds later, chaotic, confusion, dismay, fear, running away, and then kind of gathers himself a few days later. It's almost, you forget the chaos of it. Is this a common human thing? For you go through something difficult, maybe with friends, people you know, and it's quite a difficult thing. But afterwards, it's almost like a badge of honor, or some sort of. You sort of forget how terrible it was emotionally, in a sense, and it's almost something praised within you. Anyway, we've seen this happen to Rostov again. The troops marched buoyantly, as they always do when going into battle. And then here's an interesting turn. But after they had been marching for about an hour in the dense fog, the greater part of the army was forced to halt, and an unpleasant awareness of disorder and confusion spread through the ranks. How such an awareness is communicated is very difficult to define, but there is no doubt that it is communicated with extraordinary speed and accuracy. And so what's happened is the higher-ups, it's just told to us later, the high command found that our center was too far removed from the right, and the cavalry were all ordered to cross to the right side. As several thousand cavalry passed in front of them, the infantry had to wait. So someone high up had this idea, and it could be a very true and accurate, in as much as they know there's nothing irrational about it. We got to send the cavalry over here. But what happens is they have to cross in front of the infantry. And, this morale and this buoyancy that was in the infantry, suddenly it's like the plug in a big tub has been pulled and the water's draining. What's draining? This sort of buoyant enthusiasm. And morale is such an important thing in many situations with humans involved. You can take any situation, and how you perceive it matters as much as what is actually being perceived. And so the orders for this cavalry to go across, and the infantry has to halt, and there's this confusion and hubbub, and when you're moving and you're going towards your goal, it's one thing. When you're forced to kind of wait and be there's indecision and doubt creeps in quite quickly. And the soldiers in the infantry start ascribing blame to the Germans, who are part of their group. And so they're the kind of the scapegoats of this, as can typically happen with people. You find someone to blame, and it's sort of, there's a psychology to that makes you feel a little bit better, more confident. And I think that's what was happening. And higher up, it was beginning to clear, the fog, but nothing could be seen of what was going on in the front, whether all the enemy forces were, as we supposed, 10 versts away, or whether they were nearby in the fog belt. So here's a crucial strategic thing of the whole battle. The Russians and the Russian army, so they're marching on, and their intelligence is that Napoleon and his forces are kind of a little way away. So they're going to approach them thinking they're in the advantageous position, and that the logical, the smart, the rational thing to do is to push this advantage into attack. But the whole French army and Napoleon himself with his staff were not on the far side of the streams and lowlands of the villages, beyond which we intended to take up our position and begin the attack, but on the near side, so close to our forces that Napoleon could distinguish a cavalryman from an infantryman with his naked eye. And so the French army is much, much closer than thought. And we learn that what's actually happening. And so from Napoleon's point of view, we get a little bit of Napoleon's point of view, and he's up on a knoll of which the daylight goes, the fog's burning off, and he is in a position to see the Russians are actually vacating what's called the Pratzen Heights, which he believes, and accurately so, that's a critical position to this whole thing. And he can see all along the Russians are vacating that, thinking, you know, Napoleon and his forces are still a little ways ahead of them. And so, again, who's in control here? Who's to credit? Who's to blame? You know, is it the god of fog? You know, these are kind of little things I kind of don't downplay. You know, the preceding few chapters we were just given list upon list of good reasons why the Russian position was so advantageous, such that Kutuzov, who's saying, you know, I'm not too sure about this, he was just basically shouted down, disregarded, set aside. And, you know, it was like victory was inevitable. And here's the morning arrives, they're marching through the fog to get where they believe they know they should go. And in fact, what they're doing is they're evacuating the most important point. And the fog lifts where Napoleon is, and he can see this. Does this make him smart? Does this make him more intelligent than the Russians, or just fortunate? You know, I think for sure, kind of, sort of, some sort of fate is involved here. And so he sees this, and he tells the people in his command, okay, it's time for us to get going. So he makes a signal, and marshals, accompanied by adjutants, galloped off in various directions. A few minutes later, the main force of the French army were rapidly moving toward those Pratzen Heights, which were being steadily evacuated by the Russian troops, descending into the valley to the left. So just a little bit of, you could say, it's just critical information. You know, the Russians felt themselves to be just in such a superior position, and just already, right at the very beginning, you know, the Russians make decisions to kind of halt the momentum of the infantry, and they just right away, they do the one thing they shouldn't do, and evacuate that critical position. And so that's chapter 13 and 14.